Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're excited for another video. This video is going to be about the basics of oil painting and an ultimate starter kit guide to supplies you're going to need. So we're going to go over a little bit about what makes oil painting different from acrylic and watercolor, and one of those things is the mixing medium. So we're going to talk about different options you have and how they work. This here is the supply kit that I got for an oil painting class, so I'm going to go over what each of these things are. Of course, I'm going to go into depth about each of these items, but first let me just tell you what everything is. We have a sketchbook that works with oil paint, a canvas, a palette, your oil paint, flat brushes, detail brushes, a palette knife, soap, mixing mediums, and paper towels. Of course, you don't have to purchase these exact brands, but a good brand of oil paint is Winsor & Newton, their Winton oil color, and I'd suggest starting out with black, white in the primaries. So this is titanium white, ivory black, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium red hue, and cerulean blue. If you can add a couple more to that, some good ones to add would be burnt sienna and sap green. If you want more options, some other choices for good basic blue colors are French ultramarine, cobalt blue, and Prussian blue. Another nice green is Viridian. Some other choices for red are permanent alizarin crimson and permanent rose. Other browns include raw umber, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and raw sienna. Another good yellow is lemon yellow. I plan on getting that in the future, but with these here you can pretty much make all of the colors found in nature. The only others I plan on purchasing are pastel because those are kind of hard to mix. Next up are going to be your paint brushes. Now this is a lot of personal preference, but they mostly recommend bristle hair brushes because they're tougher and can pick up more paint. However, this set of 1, 2, and 3-inch flat brushes that I got are synthetic, which you can also use with oil paint, but I use these when I thin out the paint and cover large areas, and I find that it works okay for that. However, for my smaller detail brushes, I have these bristle hair Winsor & Newton brushes. I would say the most important one is this number 2 round brush. I kind of think of it as my pencil when I'm drawing outlines. You can see I got some blue paint near the base, and that's why the hairs are a little bit wild because it dried deep in there. The reason that happened is because I mixed my paint with it instead of using the palette knife, and the paint got really deep into the brush. Last, I have some really tiny bristle hair brushes for details. This is just a really affordable Artist Loft set. To mix your paint, you're going to want a large flat palette and a palette knife. It's really the only requirement is that it's large and flat. Make sure you're not using a palette with wells that you would use for watercolors because that makes it really hard to mix your paints. If you don't want to purchase a palette, I've seen a lot of people take the piece of glass out of an old picture frame and just tape off the edges and use that. Your next two supplies are the Master's soap and a soap holder because the soap gets really dirty, so you're going to want a container to put it in. The soap can be used to wash oil paint off of all your supplies, even your clothes, but it's mostly for the paint brushes. You're going to want to really scrub that paint out every time you're done painting because it will ruin the brushes if you don't completely clean them. The last supplies we have are our mixing mediums, and I saved these for last because they're probably the most intimidating and confusing supply when it comes to oil painting. It's what really makes it different from watercolor and acrylic. So let me show you what they are, and then we'll get into how they work, why they work, and I'll show you me using them. You have a lot of options when it comes to mixing mediums, but the two that I use are this clear liquid turpentine and this thicker gel liquid original. These are both types of oils because since oil paint is made up from a pigment and an oil, usually a linseed oil, you have to add more oil to thin it down. The same way, since acrylic is water-based, you add water to thin it out. For a beginner, this can be considered a con because there's so many different products out there that each work differently. It's a lot more complicated to learn than just adding water that everyone has access to. However, for more experienced painters, since there are so many different options, you can really customize the paint to work however you want it to. When painting in layers, you're going to want to paint thin to thick. You can see this liquid is a lot thicker than the turpentine, so you're going to want to paint that on top, because if your top layer is thinner and dries before your bottom layer, when your bottom layer dries, it can pull apart and cause that top layer to crack. Although both of these mixing mediums help the paint go further and dry faster, they each have a different effect on the paint. The liquid makes it a little bit thicker and the brush strokes smoother, while the turpentine can make it even thinner and cover the whole sheet a lot easier, while having a little less gloss and drying a little bit faster. So I'm going to test them both out, swatch them so you can see how they work. You can also add different amounts of each medium to get a little bit of a different effect. But just to show you the basics of how they work today, I'm going to add a lot of each so you can see the extremes. The first paint I'm going to swatch is going to be just oil paint on its own so that you can see how it performs. Just because mixing mediums are so popular doesn't mean that you don't use oil paint on its own also. It's one of the textures and choices you have is to use that plain oil paint. A lot of people use it towards the end of their painting to add the details. You can see it skipping over the texture of the paper because it's so thick. Next, we're going to add the Liquid Original to the paint, and I just want to say here that I'm not taking my own advice and I'm mixing with the brush, which you should really do the mixing with a palette knife, because as I said before, if you're mixing large amounts of paint, it can really get into the base of the bristles and mess up that brush. So since I was just doing such a small amount, I'm mixing it here, but you can see I'm getting it deeper into the brush, so I really should have used a palette knife. I used a little more paint than I did liquid, but I did use a good amount of liquid, and the effect it's going to give is a much smoother brush stroke. It's going to cover more area because it's thinning the paint out, but it's keeping it somewhat thick, and it's going to have a more glossy finish once it dries. This swatch here is going to dry slightly faster than the first swatch because the liquid speeds up the drying, but it's going to dry a little bit more glossy, and it's still going to take quite a long time to dry, which is one of the things I like about oil paint, because you can go back and continue to work with it. Right here I'm adding just pure liquid, and it's continuing to thin it out and make it go further. The same way you could add water to acrylic and do that, but it's going to work even better because the paint is nowhere near dry, whereas with the acrylic it could be almost dry already. Next up, we're going to swatch the turpentine. You can see a little bit of blue in the water because I cleaned off my other brush in there before I took it to the sink with the soap. So you kind of use it the same way you use water to clean your brushes. That's why I have this little bit of turpentine in a separate jar, because you're not going to use your actual supply because it dirties the water. So I pretty much coated all the bristles in turpentine and just squeezed off the excess back into the jar, so there's a good amount in the brush still. I had to take a little bit more of the regular paint just to mix in there because I did have a lot of turpentine. You don't have to use this much, or you could use even more than this if you just wanted a really light glaze. So that's another thing, you can use different amounts to get different effects. I'm going to take just a tiny bit more since there was a lot of paint stuck on my brush, and I really wanted to show you the effect of that turpentine. You can see with all that turpentine, it really thins that paint out and gets a beautiful smooth brush stroke. You can cover really large areas when you use this. And if you don't want it to be quite this watered down looking, you can always just add the tiniest amount just to get something in between the two. So this bottom swatch is going to dry the quickest, then the second, and then the top. If you're adding linseed oil mixture, that's going to dry slower than the regular paint. So remember, if you're using these mediums, you're going to want to paint the thinnest, quickest drying first, just so that you can avoid any cracking as your paint dries. The last thing we have to cover is cleaning up, and what you're going to want to do is take those paper towels, wipe off all the excess paint from the brushes onto that, then rinse them out in that turpentine you have in a spare jar. Squeeze the turpentine out, take them to the sink, and really clean them out with that soap. Make sure you have no paint left because it will ruin the bristles if it dries. I hope this video was informative for you. If you have any questions, just comment them below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in the next one.